Hey guys, how we doing? I'm trying to figure out a good way to greet you guys on these videos because I can't say good morning, right? Because it might not be morning. You might be watching it in the afternoon, or who knows, at night, right? Can't say good afternoon for the same reason. So I don't know. Just maybe something like what's up, right? Anyway, how's everyone doing? Hopefully, well. Okay. Um, Again, a lot of you are keeping up well on these daily classes and getting your daily class participation comments in. Well done. If you're behind on that, you really need to catch up. You really need to do that. Missing one or two daily participation grades isn't going to hurt you too bad, but if you miss a lot, it's going to hurt your grade badly. Okay? You don't want to fail this class. Okay? I know this is different and it's maybe a bit more of a challenge, um, but let's finish this year out strong, despite the fact that it's not a typical ending to the school year, right? Okay, let's do a little bit of review before we get started on today's lesson. So we just finished with World War II, right? What was the impact that World War II had on the world? How many people did it kill? Approximately 55 million, right? It was mass destruction. The entire continent of Europe, and what country were in shambles? Japan. Who emerged as the new world power? United States of America. Japan's role in World War II. Again, I hope you're following along in your notes. It's very important. We will be taking a quiz probably next week, okay? So plan for a quiz sometime next week, probably around Wednesday or so of next week. Got it? All right. What was Japan's role in World War II? Or at least how was Japan defeated, maybe I should say. The U.S. began taking back the islands in the Pacific. It was very bloody and costly. A very important battle happened at Midway. How did the U.S. finally conquer mainland Japan? With what? 2 atomic bombs. And a lot of people say ever since those atomic bombs were dropped, the world has never been the same. There's always this threat of nuclear warfare. We now have the capacity of mass destruction, right? On August 14, 1945, Japan agreed to surrender. Italy and Germany, how were they defeated? The U.S. and Britain pushed up from Africa. Eventually they took Italy. They firebombed what country from the air? Germany. They retook France and advanced from the west. And which country advanced from the east? The USSR. Eventually, the Nazi regime crumbled. What brought the United States into the war? The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor destroyed what? A large portion of the U.S. Navy. The 2 alliances that came together during World War II were the Axis powers, who were made up of what 3 countries? Germany, Italy, and Japan. And the Allied powers, who were made up of actually about 50 countries, but the big 3 were Great Britain, USSR, and the United States. Okay? So what were some contributing factors in World War II? There was unrest in Europe. Because why? Does anybody remember? We don't have this written down, but the Great Depression, right? The aftermath of World War I, there was just a lot of problems, a lot of issues, poverty, economic struggles. People were upset. They were looking for something better, and it left a power vacuum. And who steps into the power vacuum? Despots, right? You have tyrants. And who were three of kind of the most well-known tyrants? Joe Stalin, who was the dictator of what country? USSR. What was his ideology? Communism, right? There was another guy, Benito Mussolini, who was the dictator of Italy. And his ideology was called fascism. The last one, most well known, Adolf Hitler, Germany, and he was a Nazi. All right, so World War II is over, thankfully. No World War III, at least not yet. Hopefully never, right? But anyway, World War II ends, and we are going to take a look at kind of the next time period in history. And today's lesson, actually, yes, history lesson 40, the war that never happened. Okay? So after World War II, you have a lot of things going on, right? Thankfully, Germany was defeated, Japan was defeated, their aspirations at world domination were stopped. But remember, well, and let's back up a little bit. How did the war end with Japan? 2 nuclear bombs. Well, they weren't nuclear, they were atomic bombs. Later, we have nuclear bombs developed, which are way worse than atomic bombs, right? Thankfully, we've never actually, nuclear bombs have never been used in war. They've been tested, they've been exploded as tests, but they've never been used in a war, thankfully. But it changed the world. Now suddenly the world has to think about the fact that we have these massive weapons at our disposal. And do we really want to use them? Do we really want to live in a world that has these huge, massive bombs, right? And how do we avoid ever using them? That's what people had to wrestle with. The United States pulled the trigger 2 times and dropped 2 atomic bombs, and it was devastatingly destructive, right? And people are like, we don't ever want that to happen again. So what are we going to do? How are we going to keep that from happening, right? So what happens in the aftermath of World War II? Well, of course, the United States, who were the allies again? United States, Great Britain, the USSR. Now, okay, the United States and Great Britain, fine, that's not a big problem. But the one problem is one of the countries who is part of the Allies is the USSR, right? And remember how we talked about it. Joe Stalin was one of the despots. He was one of those evil dictators. He was not a good man, all right? He was, he arguably, some people make the case that he was far worse than Adolf Hitler, the amount of people that he killed. Now, he had a longer time period to do the destruction that he did and to kill the amount of people that he killed. Hitler did it in a much shorter period of time. But he was a wicked man, all right? He was a despot. He was a ruthless tyrant. He was not concerned about world peace. You know, the United States is just happy that the war is over and now we can live in peace. You know, same with Great Britain, same with a lot of other countries in the world. You know, we stopped the Germans, we stopped Japan. stop the Italians. Now we can just sit back and live our lives, right? Except one of the guys that we teamed up with to win that war should have been one of the bad guys, right? Just so happened that because of how things played out, we needed him on our side. And so we helped him, he helped us, and we won the war that way. But now what are we going to do? Because now we have this powerful tyrant in the USSR named Joseph Stalin, who also maybe has some aspirations for a certain amount of world domination. What are we going to do about that, right? So one of the things that happened after World War II is the United Nations was formed. Okay, and the United Nations is still going on to this day. But all of the Allied countries came together and formed an alliance. And the purpose of the alliance was to try to keep wars like World War II from ever happening again. And they used a variety of methods to do that. Now, thankfully, when they had peace treaty, when they came up with the peace treaty, when they signed the peace treaty after World War II, they didn't impose these horrific sanctions on Germany and Italy and Japan the way they had done before. Because what does that do? That ends up punishing people that aren't really responsible for the actions of the leaders. Now again, a lot of people went along with Hitler, Benito Mussolini, Emperor Hirohito in Japan. A lot of people went along with it. That's very true. But you can't really put all the responsibility on everybody, right? You can't make everybody suffer for the actions of a few. So the United States really actually helped Japan get back on their feet after World War II and become a successful nation. Now Germany's a little bit different. The way that they decided to handle Germany was, in essence, instead of actually just putting sanctions on them, they basically dissolved them. They turned Germany into a country that was completely ruled by the Allied nations. Instead of letting them continue as a country, they made them their own country, right? Okay, so the problem is you have three allies, right? And somehow France, they were kind of part of the Allies too. They had gotten conquered for a while during World War II, but they were, eventually they were liberated, and so they were sort of part of the Allied group too. We didn't talk about that a lot, but they were in on it too. So what the Allied forces did after World War II to keep Germany from ever causing trouble again, because again they were blamed for World War I, right? And they were fairly responsible for World War II. Now, World War I, they were partially responsible, but they weren't the only ones. World War II is pretty much Germany's fault. I mean, you could say Japan had a lot to do with it too, Italy too, but Germany really, they really were the ones that probably started World War II. Okay? So to keep them from causing problems again, the Allies just took them over. They took over the whole country, and they divided it into 4 sections. Okay? They divided, and they gave the USSR control of one section, the United States control of one section, Great Britain control of one section, and France control of one section. Okay, so I'm going to illustrate that. I'm going to try to diagram that on the board. Actually, I'm just going to wait. I'm just going to wait to do that, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Okay, so they divided it into 4 sections. And then they took the capital city of Berlin, Germany. Okay, Berlin is the capital city of Germany, and they divided it into 4 sections. All right. Again, part of it under control of France, part under control of the United States, part Great Britain, and part the Soviet Union, the USSR. All right. The problem is the city of Berlin is in the section of Germany that's part of the USSR, all right? And that's going to cause problems later, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So anyway, you have the United Nations, and they come together, and their plan, and all these nations, allied nations, and they come up with a plan to try to keep this from happening again, right? Harry Truman is the president. Remember, FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, died close to the end of World War II. He was in poor health. He was actually in a wheelchair most of his presidency. He died close to the end of World War II. Harry Truman, his vice president, took over. He's the one that made the decision to drop the 2 atomic bombs on Japan. And then you have, the division of Germany. Part of what the United Nations did was they divided up Germany with the goal of doing their absolute best to keep Germany from ever causing another one of these wars, right? In the meantime, again, you have the rise of the Soviet Union, the rise of the USSR. Again, the USSR stands for Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. It's easier to say Soviet Union or USSR. Okay. Anyway, they start to gain power. How did they do that? Well, here's the thing. During World War II, remember what happened in World War II? Germany invaded Russia, or the USSR, right? Hitler, he pulled his forces away from Great Britain because he wasn't having much success, and he decided to head into the USSR and to try to take the USSR. It was successful at first, but eventually, because of the harsh winters and the fierce resistance from the Soviet fighters, he was pushed back, all the way back down into Germany. Right. So as the Soviet Union forces pushed their way back into Germany, they occupied countries between Germany and the Soviet Union. Okay, there's several countries kind of between, and I don't have a map to show you, but there's several countries kind of between Germany and the Soviet Union. So as the Soviet Union pushed back into Germany, their troops occupied those countries. Now, when World War II ended, the natural thing would have been to just be like, okay, we're done here, and pull back into the Soviet Union, right? But instead, the Soviet Union decided to say, hey, well, we've already occupied these countries. We're just going to stay there. We're just going to keep our power there. And we're going to set up our Soviet control in these other countries. So they took a whole bunch of other countries in Eastern Europe and made them part of the Soviet Union. So countries like Romania, Hungary, eventually Czechoslovakia, a whole bunch of those kind of border countries. Poland, maybe, I can't remember. But the Ukraine was another one. The Soviet Union just swallowed them up and made them part of their country and forced them to be part of their Soviet Union. People call it the Soviet bloc. Those countries had no choice. Suddenly they were just swallowed up by the Soviet Union, and they were forced to live in a communist country. It'd be kind of like if for some reason the United States decided to go to war with South America, and on our way down to South America, we had to go through Central America, right? We had to go through Mexico, Guatemala, Panama, and all those Belize, all those little countries in Central America. We had to go through there to get to South America and fight them, right? We get down there, we fight them, we conquer them, we defeat them. And then we decide, hey, you know what? Since we're here in Central America already anyway, we're just going to keep it. We're just going to make it part of our country, and we're just going to keep it. Now suddenly Mexico, Belize, Guatemala, Panama, suddenly they're all part of the United States. That's basically what Russia did, okay? Or the Soviet Union. So they occupied the small countries and made them part of the Soviet bloc. So communism starts to gain strength. Communism was actually a popular idea in the early to mid 1900s. And let me just explain communism very simply. I don't have a lot of time, and I don't want to get into all of it. But communism was the ideology that comes from a guy named Karl Marx, who would have originally been called Marxism. We studied this in world history last year, so you guys that were in world history last year maybe remember this. Karl Marx, as I said last year, of all the bad ideas that have been formulated in history, you can argue that Karl Marx's idea of Marxism was the granddaddy of bad ideas. Okay? Marxism was the idea that free markets are bad, that private property is bad, that all of that just leads to inequality. Okay? All of that leads to certain people getting oppressed, government having too much power, and inequality, rich people, poor people, certain groups taking advantage of other groups, and all of that. So in Marxist communist ideology, capitalism is bad. Capitalism is the system of government or the economic system that we have in the United States. Okay? They would say capitalism is bad. You shouldn't be able to just start your own business. You shouldn't be able to, work for whoever you want to work for. There shouldn't be private property because that creates competition and tension. And again, some people take advantage of that and put other people down, and it just leads to divisions and inequality and all kinds of bad things, right? That was the philosophy behind Marxism. Now Marxists believed that eventually communism and Marxism would prevail. That eventually the proletariat, which is the governing forces, would all be destroyed and done away with. That we won't need government anymore. We won't need presidents. We won't need kings. We won't need emperors. They'll all be put down, and everybody will just live kind of in harmony with each other. And there will be this communist utopia where everybody works for the common good. And you share your stuff. There's no private property. Everybody's just working together. Kumbaya. Everybody's happy. Communism has a major theological problem, right? A major theological problem. It does not account for the problem of sin and selfishness, right? Communism is an atheistic system. It doesn't acknowledge God, and it does not believe in biblical principles of morality. And you can even make arguments from the Bible that God designed us to have a certain amount of free market, ownership and things like that. Throughout the Bible, there's it's not really commanded that this is the way it has to be, but there are indications that that's the way it should be. That people should have their own things. That they should have their own land. Good competition can be a good thing. It can stimulate an economy, right? Because if there's no competition, you're not going to try as hard as you can to be the best. And that's communism's fatal flaw, right? When there's no competition, no free markets, no personal ownership of anything, you lose all motivation to work, right? And so that's what happens in communism, is people lose their motivation. The economy is terrible. People are hungry. There's food lines. It's just a bad situation. In pretty much every communist country, it has almost always been this way. And the only time that countries that are even partway communist have flourished is because is if and when they pull back those restrictions and let their country have a certain amount of free market. So if you look at China, China is actually a really powerful and, in a certain sense, you might say, thriving country. And they're communist. But part of the reason they're thriving is because they have pulled back a lot of their communist restrictions and allowed a certain amount of free markets. And there's a lot of other factors that play into it too that I can't get into. But you also got to remember that in China there is widespread, rampant poverty amongst a lot of people. There's a lot of people in China who are not doing well. And communism isn't supposed to be like that. In communism, everybody should be doing the same. Everybody should be doing well, according to the communists, right? And there should be no, strong dictatorial government in place. That's the ideology of communism, is that there should be no despots. There should be no government oppressing the people. That's the ideology behind communism. And in every single situation, that's exactly what it becomes. It becomes the very thing that it wasn't supposed to be. Marxism was supposed to do away with unjust, corrupt government. Russia comes along and becomes the catalyst, the first Marxist, communist, big-time communist government. Guess what? That's exactly what they get. Joseph Stalin was one of the worst dictators in the history of the world. The very thing that communism was supposed to be against. Okay. Anyway, that's my little spiel about communism. Okay, so anyway, but it starts to spread. And in every country that communism spreads into, it's very controlling and tyrannical. And the economy is bad, and people are hungry, and things are not going well. But they think that they have the answers to the world problems, and their idea is to spread this ideology to every country they possibly can. So they spread out, and they take several other countries, right? And so the world gets divided into two groups, okay? Communist countries and free countries, all right? So you have the communist bloc and the free world bloc. Now, mainly the communist bloc is the USSR, Russia, and all those little satellite countries around it that it took over. At first, that's how it starts. That's the communist bloc. So Eastern Europe, Russia, all those little countries, they're the communists. Western Europe, the United States, they're the free countries. And it's kind of like you have these two opposing worldviews, these two opposing ideologies. An ideology of freedom, free markets, and an ideology of tight, dictatorial, no free markets, no private ownership, communistic mentality in the communist countries. Okay? And there becomes this tension between these two ideologies, this constant tension. Who's going to win? Who's going to take over the world? What idea, what ideology is eventually going to win out and spread around the globe? And the Americans are determined to not let the communists win. And remember, America is now the premier world power. We can't be like looking around at anybody else and be like, hey, you go get them. Okay? Great Britain, go get them. You know, they're your problem. We can't do that anymore because we are now the world power. If anybody's going to take care of it, we have to take care of it. So you have communism versus the free world. And Winston Churchill was in the United States visiting Harry Truman, and he's telling him, you know, we're going to have to start looking out for Russia and the Soviet Union. Things are not great there. Remember, Winston Churchill was one of the first ones to warn about Hitler. Now he's one of the first ones to say, listen, we're going to have to be careful about these communists in the Soviet Union. What's going on is not good. And he used the term Iron Curtain. He said an Iron Curtain has descended on Eastern Europe. So that's kind of the term that gets used now to describe communism. This huge Iron Curtain descends around all these countries. And these countries, the way that they conduct themselves is through manipulation and control and secrecy. Secret police are trying to keep anybody from doing something they shouldn't do that undermines what the communists are doing. And it's all, you know, it's a system of fear and darkness, right? And so he used the term Iron Curtain, and that term stuck. That's what people even today refer to the communist bloc as being hidden behind an Iron Curtain. Okay, so let's talk about the war that never happened. We call this the Cold War. Okay, the Cold War is the term that we refer to this tension between communism, the Soviet Union basically, and the free world, or mainly the United States. Okay? This tension between the Soviet Union, who represents communism, and the United States, who represents the free world. there was this constant tension that lasted for about 30, 40, 50 years maybe, between these two countries and these two ideologies. And technically, there was never a shot fired. There was never any fatalities or casualties. But it was this tension. And that's why we call it the Cold War. Now, the thing is, just because the Cold War never actually blew up into a full-scale war, there were other wars that happened because of the Cold War that were actually wars where there was bloodshed. And we'll get to that in a bit. All right? So I told you that, and I'm going to try to explain the situation in Berlin. All right? Because this is very interesting, and it helps you understand some important things. So now I'm going to draw the country of Germany, and it's not going to look like Germany, but I'm just going to draw a shape in order to give you an idea of what happened, right? So I'm just going to draw a circle. I'll make it like this. I don't know. Anyway, let's say that is the country of Germany. I know it looks nothing like Germany, but anyway, let's say it's the country of Germany. Okay. Now, after World War II, the Allies divide Germany into 4 blocks, right? So 4 blocks. Okay. France gets one. Great Britain or the United Kingdom gets one, and the United States gets one. And who gets the last one? The USSR. Okay? So now, again, this is not how it looked. It was divided up very differently from this. But I'm just trying to illustrate what's going on, right? So basically, Germany gets divided into 4 sections, and it gets divided up between these 4 countries. Now, what they also did is they divided the city of Berlin into 4 sections. Okay? The capital city of Berlin. Berlin is the capital of Germany. So for some reason, they didn't just divide up the country, they also divided the capital. All right, now here's the problem. So let's do this. Let's say this is the city of Berlin. And I'm just going to draw a square to represent the city of Berlin. Okay? So, same thing. You have France, UK, US, and USSR. All right? The city of Berlin gets divided into 4 sections, just like the country. So this would be like if the United States had been the country that was defeated. The United States would have been divided into 4 sections, right? So the top, western, Montana, Washington, they would all belong to Great Britain. All right, the southwestern, Colorado, California would all belong to USSR. No, that's France, let's say. All right, top eastern side, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan would all belong to Germany. To the southeastern side, Georgia, South Carolina, all those places would belong to the USSR, right? But then the capital city of Washington, D.C. would also be split up amongst those 4 countries. Does that make sense? That's how it was in Germany. Now, here's the thing. So, the capital city of Berlin is divided amongst these 4 countries. But here's the thing. That capital city is located in the middle of the territory that is controlled by the USSR. Okay, so we're just pretending that this is like a blow-up, right? So let's say this is the city of Berlin shrunk down, right? It's located in the middle of the section controlled by the Soviet Union. Now, initially, this isn't a big deal, right? It's just kind of, well, maybe you, if you live in this section of the city, you live in the U.S. section. That's cool, right? If you live in this section of the city, you live in the United Kingdom section. If you live in this section, you live in the French section. If you live in this one, you live in the section of the USSR. Now, here's the thing. As time goes on, and the USSR becomes more and more communist, what happens in the communist countries? Remember what I said? The economy isn't good. There's no free markets, right? You're hungry half the time. Everything's bare. because the government won't let you just do whatever you want to do. There's secret police sneaking around, like busting people for doing something you have no idea you're doing anything wrong, and all of a sudden one of your friends happen to be a secret police and you like takes you to jail. So if you're living in this section of Berlin, the section that's controlled by the USSR, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? You'd be like, no, I'm not staying here, right? I'm going over here. So people would leave, and this was called East Berlin, okay? The way it was divided up is the USSR had most of kind of the eastern section, right? So this was called East Berlin. And by the way, the section of Germany that the USSR had was also called East Germany. Anyway, so they'd be like, no way, I'm not staying here. And so they go to the U.S. or they go whatever part. And eventually these three actually combined and were all one and the same, right? So it didn't really matter where. But this section was a much better place to live than this section. So people would just go from there to there. People just en masse would leave the USSR section and go into the section that was controlled by the U.S., France, and the United Kingdom, because it was a much better place to live, right? Well, the USSR didn't like this. They hated it. This is not good. This is not working. And so what did they do? They cut off all connection from anywhere into this section, okay? They blockaded the railroads. They blockaded the roads. They wouldn't let any supplies, any food, any materials come in from the outside. And remember, they're all around it, right? They're around the whole thing because we're inside this territory owned by the Soviet Union, so they can control that. So they wouldn't allow anybody to send anything in, okay? They wouldn't allow them to send, they stopped the trains, they stopped trucks, whatever. They wouldn't allow anything in, okay? Got it? So that these people living in here were in bad shape. You know, they had no food. And the plan of the Soviet Union was they wanted to eventually take control of that section. Now, the United States decided we can't let that happen. We can't let the communists do that. If we let them do that, we're showing them that they can control us. And then they're going to try to do more. And they're going to continue to try to spread the communist ideologies around the world. We've got to stop them. Now, they were afraid to resist, you know, because that could start another war. So if they send troops over and start escorting, you know, trains and trucks in there, that looks like an act of aggression, and that could lead to war. So they don't want to do that. So what do they do? It's called the Berlin Airlift. All right? The United States sends airplanes. Okay? I know these are terrible looking airplanes. Hey, stop laughing at my drawings. Okay? They send airplanes. For over a year, airplanes fly into West Berlin with food. Alright? And it was like one airplane every 3 minutes. That's how often they had to fly in there in order to keep the people of West Berlin supplied with food and whatever other things they needed. And Truman did that for over a year to keep this section free. And it worked. Okay? Eventually, the communists backed down. And they said, this isn't working. Because the only thing they could have shot down one of the airplanes, right? But that would have been an act of aggression, an act of war too. And the communists weren't quite ready to start a war either. They wanted to spread their communist ideologies, but they weren't quite ready to start a war. Because again, the United States is a powerful country. You want to be careful about starting a war with them. So anyway, that's what we refer to as the Berlin Airlift, and it was a very strategic, very important part of resisting communist the spread of communism. Okay, and so we sent airplanes to West Berlin for over a year to keep them supplied with food and whatever other things they needed. Okay, so that's the Berlin airlift, and that's an important part of the Cold War. And we will talk a little bit more about Berlin soon. So you have the Berlin airlift. You also have the formation of an organization called NATO. So once again, this is kind of like an alliance, sort of like allies coming together to fight against the Axis powers. The United States and numerous other nations come together and they say, basically, we're allies. And so if one of us gets attacked, we're all in this together. We're going to defend each other. We're not going to let the communists push their way around with any of us. So if you were in the NATO alliance and you got attacked, all the other nations that had signed that particular agreement had decided that if that happens, we're going to come to your aid. We're going to come help you fight. Right? So that's NATO. The Soviet Union responded to that with something called the Warsaw Pact. And that was kind of something similar, only it was communist countries, Soviet Union countries, coming together to resist the NATO countries. Again, now we talked about imperialism versus isolationism several classes ago. Remember that? The United States was wrestling between whether or not they should be imperialistic and just go for it and get involved in all kinds of other countries' affairs all around the world, or should they just, kind of hunker down and protect themselves and focus on themselves and keep their patties out of other countries' business. Well, guess what? After World War II and this whole debacle with communism and so forth, we pretty much give up on the idea of isolationism, all right? And we become fairly imperialistic. So we're going to write abandonment of isolationism. The United States sets up around 700 military outposts all around the world, okay? And we still have military outposts all around the world. If a person joins, the Air Force, the Navy, or the military, they could get stationed in many different places throughout the world because we still have military, what do we call them? Stations all around the world, right? Because we're no longer isolationists. We are now much more imperialistic. It's not that we're necessarily trying to expand. I said it, back up. We're not so much imperialistic. We're not isolationist, but we're not really imperialistic. We're not really concerned about expanding our territory and building our empire as we are about, maintaining peace and helping countries that are friendly to us and resisting countries that pose a threat to us and that kind of thing. So it's not, I wouldn't call it quite imperialism, but it's also definitely not isolationism either. We had something called the Marshall Plan, which is I think it was a guy named George Marshall. He was a cabinet member, and one of the things that was happening was that communism was a fairly popular idea, and a lot of countries were going for it. They were like, okay, let's try this new communist thing because our country is in shambles. So it's kind of like, after World War I, the economies were bad, countries were in a bad shape, and so there was this vacuum, and people were looking for somebody to step in and fix things, right? And so that's when these dictators like Hitler and Mussolini stepped in, right? And it was kind of like that. Countries are struggling in Europe, again, because of the devastation and the destruction of World War II. Europe is still just in bad shape, right? The economy is bad. People are hungry. They're poor. It's just a lot of bad things going on in Europe. And so there's a lot of countries that are thinking about, maybe we should become communist too. communism was supposedly this good alternative to poverty and to government corruption and to people in economies that were struggling, right? It was supposedly this good alternative to that. So there were a lot of countries that were teetering on the edge of trying to decide, should they just join the Soviet bloc and become communist countries? So the United States started getting concerned about this, because if Europe gets swallowed up by communism, we suddenly have this huge enemy. It was much bigger than just Russia and the surrounding countries. So the United States came up with this plan, the Marshall Plan, where we send aid. Because again, the United States is prospering during this time. After World War II, the United States the economy had strengthened, and they were prospering in a lot of ways. The 1950s and 60s, the economy was just taking off. It struggled a little bit after World War II, again, because when people didn't have to work toward the war effort anymore, they weren't quite sure what to do. But it didn't take long for it to take off and become really strong. And so the United States, they have all these resources, they have more money than other countries, so they start investing in Europe. And that's called the Marshall Plan, where they sent money. Sometimes it was just gifts. They just gave them money and resources, and sometimes it was in the form of loans. They loaned money to the Europeans to get their economies going, to get them strengthened, so that they could get back on their feet, so they're not tempted to go become communists, because we don't want that, right? So it was actually a smart thing, and it kind of worked. It got a lot of European countries it got them back on their feet, got their economies going, and made so that they didn't have to fall into communism, to fall back on communism to try to find a solution to their problems, right? So the Marshall Plan. In the middle of all this, we have another big, huge, powerful country at this point that decided to become communist as well. Does anybody know what country that might have been? China. Yes. So at this point, China becomes communist. Now this is very alarming, because now not only do you have this huge, massive nation called the Soviet Union that is communist, but you have the most populated nation in the world, China, becomes communist. And that suddenly becomes another, wow, okay? The communist thing is taken off, and we're going to have to figure out what to do about it, right? So there was this fear of the domino effect. Fear of the domino effect. What do I mean by that? Well, people were afraid that if one country becomes communist, it's going to be like dominoes falling, and a whole bunch more are just going to keep becoming communist. So if a little country like Korea becomes communist, then all of a sudden a whole bunch of other countries around it are going to follow suit. And it's just going to go from one country to the next until it spreads across the large portion of the world. The United States was very concerned about the domino effect. And this led to two conflicts that really are sort of an embarrassment to Americans in the 20th century. The first one happens in Korea. So, guess what? Korea is this tiny little nation in Southeast Asia. After World War II, the Soviet Union occupied Korea. Now, in order to buy the Soviet Union's assistance against Japan, the United States agreed to give the Soviet Union part of Korea. Okay? This just goes to show how what seems to be small decisions have huge impacts later on, right? The United States decides to give the Soviet Union part of Korea. Guess what part that was? North Korea. And to this day, North Korea is a communist country, and they've become one of the biggest enemies of world, of stability in the world scene. Okay? They become one of the most dangerous enemies of Western democracy in the world. And it all stems back to this little decision. Hey, to buy the Russians, to get them to help us against Japan, we're going to give them North Korea. Well, guess what? Now we got to deal with North Korea. Anyway, the Russians had occupied Korea. We decided to give them North Korea. South Korea remained under the control of the Allies. But in the process of all of this Cold War stuff going down, the Soviet Union decides they want South Korea too, right? So they start to invade South Korea. Well, we decide we can't let that happen because we're afraid of the domino effect. We're afraid that if we let them have South Korea, it's just going to spread from that country to the next country to the next country to the next, right? And so that ends up in a full-scale war called the Korean War. And we had a certain amount of success initially. General Douglas MacArthur went over there. He pushed the North Koreans way back up to the very top of their country, and it looked like we were going to win. Well, guess who gets involved? China decides they're going to help. So China, a whole bunch of soldiers start charging over from China and fighting against the Americans and the South Koreans and push us all the way back down to about the same place where the division had been before. Finally, we're like, okay, forget it. We don't want to fight you guys. Douglas MacArthur actually wanted to drop the atomic bomb on China, but Truman wouldn't do it. He was like, no, we're not doing that again. So anyway, MacArthur got angry. He started disobeying Truman's orders and stuff, and Truman was like, fine, you're fired. And he fired him. And because, again, the president is the commander-in-chief of the United States Army. But anyway, so eventually they pushed us and the South Koreans back down, and we made a truce, and the boundary ended up staying at about the same place that it had been before. So the war was kind of pointless, except that we did keep them from expanding communism into South Korea. I guess you say it wasn't maybe completely pointless, because, again, we were concerned that if they do that, the domino effect would happen and more countries would become communist, right? So that was the Korean War, but there was another conflict that breaks out in a little country called Vietnam, okay? The Vietnam War. Once again, Vietnam had been split into two. The northern section was under communist control under a leader named Ho Chi Minh. They wanted control of both North and South, so they tried to get that, and so the United States decided to send people over to help South Vietnam fight against North Vietnam. And eventually we just sent 700 people, mainly to advise the South Vietnamese and give them some aid and so forth. Well, over time we started to send more and more and more soldiers, and the next thing we know, we're in this full-scale, bloody, brutal conflict with North Vietnam. And the problem in the Vietnam War was that the North Vietnamese, they were so bent on overtaking the entire country that they just didn't care. They would do anything, right? So they did guerrilla warfare. There was this group called the Viet Cong, which was a North Vietnamese and even USSR-backed group that was in South Vietnam doing guerrilla warfare. What's guerrilla warfare? Well, it's when you kind of hide out in the jungle or the mountains, whichever you live in. In Vietnam, it was the jungle. And you sneak in and you attack, and then you go back and you hide in the jungle again. And it's very hard to find those kind of people and actually defeat them. It's hard to know where they're at. They can hide in the jungle, and the other thing was sometimes they were dressed like soldiers and sometimes they weren't, and so you never knew who the enemy was. Sometimes the enemy was little kids who had been trained to take hand grenades and walk up to the American troops and lob a hand grenade into a bunch of American troops. And so there are stories from Vietnam where sometimes American soldiers would gun down children because they were afraid that they were coming to bomb them, right? Because the children had been trained by the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong to do this. So it was a very hard battle to fight. It was hard to know who the enemy was. And it just turned into a mess. It turned into a bloodbath. We tried to bomb the daylights out of North Vietnam, and a lot of civilians died. We tried to spray the jungles to kill the jungle foliage so that the Viet Cong guerrilla soldiers couldn't hide in the jungle, and it kind of worked, but it destroyed like acres and acres and acres of jungle and probably food sources for the local village people and stuff like that. It just turned into a mess, and eventually the war became very unpopular in the United States. People were it's kind of where the whole anti-war sentiment really started to grow strong in the United States, and to a certain degree continues to this day. After World War II, we beat the Germans, and World War I, we beat the Germans, and World War II, we beat the Germans and the Japanese, and everybody's, yeah, we can do this, But after Vietnam, it was kind of like, we're kind of sick of this. We're kind of sick of killing people. It's just not working as good anymore. And so these are two conflicts that are a result of the Cold War. So the Cold War itself was not a war and was not bloody, but there are two very bloody wars that come out of the Cold War. Okay? Eventually, the United States just pulled out of Vietnam and said, we can't do it. They pulled out. Well, guess what? 2 years later, North Vietnam went down and just took over South Vietnam. Now, there's only one country of Vietnam, and it's communist. And it's not a good place to live. It's just not. So, bad situation. We tried to help. Didn't work. It's the way it is. It was messy. Communism and the fight against communism in this Cold War became messy. So let's talk about something called the arms race. So again, World War II happens, and we drop these two atomic bombs. Again, this is still under the Cold War. Okay, World War II happens, we drop two atomic bombs, and again, the world becomes a different place, right? So now, rather than just building up your military and building up your cavalry and your navy and all of that, you got to think about weapons, right? Weapons of mass destruction. Whoever has the biggest, baddest, strongest, most powerful weapons, they're the ones that are going to win. Okay, so the United States has an atomic bomb. We eventually develop what we call a nuclear bomb, which is kind of like an atomic bomb. It's just like 700 times worse. So we develop a nuclear bomb. Well, guess what? So does the Soviet Union. And when the Soviet Union successfully tests a nuclear bomb in the 1950s, suddenly the United States is like, whoa, we have an enemy to deal with. These guys have the same weapons that we have. And that's not good. It's not good, right? So we have this thing called the arms race, where the United States and the Soviet Union are racing to get the biggest, baddest, strongest stockpile of nuclear bombs you can possibly get. Because if you let the other country get ahead, it gives them the upper hand. Right? We don't want them to have the upper hand because they really want to spread communism all around the world. So we have to keep stockpiling nuclear bombs and missiles that can launch them farther and farther and farther distances. So that they launch one on us, we can launch one back. Right? So that's what we call the arms race. There was a lot of fear and tension. If you talk to your grandparents, they might remember this, okay? They might remember that there was a lot of tension during the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. They might have even had nuclear attack drills where you had to put on masks and maybe go into an underground bunker or something like that. If they went to public school, which probably some of your grandparents may have gone to public school because there wasn't nearly as many Christian schools back then. So there was this constant fear. What if the Russians pull the trigger? What if they send a nuclear bomb over and take out New York City. What's going to happen? And the world was lived in this constant state of fear and tension. Now the upside was, in all of that, a lot of people turned to God. People started going to church more. You know, when you're worried about the world ending or civilization as we know it being blown to smithereens, you start thinking about things like that, right? So more people went to church. That's actually when we got the terms "in God we trust" on the penny. A lot of people think that started at the beginning of our nation. It didn't start at the beginning of our nation. It started during the Cold War when people were deathly afraid of the nuclear bomb. They started putting "in God we trust" on the penny. That's also when in the Pledge of Allegiance we started saying "one nation under God." Okay, it was during that time. Another race that happened is what we call the space race. In the 1960s or 70s, I can't remember which, the Soviet Union launched a satellite into outer space. It was called Sputnik. Okay, it was a satellite that started orbiting the Earth. For the first time, mankind had put something from Earth into space. Now there was nobody in it; it was just a satellite. But you could see it. People would sit, they would go out after dark and they could see the lights go across the sky. And people were fascinated with this. But it was the Russians that put it there. Okay, it was the Soviet Union. And the United States was like, we got to do something about this. We got to catch up to them. Now, why does it matter who wins the space race? Because the space race is about getting people into space, right? Getting people to the moon. Getting satellites put up there. Who cares about that? You know, why not just build up your weapons and get ready for war? Well, the thing is, space technology has to be very advanced. And so whoever is winning the space race means that they are winning the overall race for better and better technology. And whoever has the best technology is eventually going to get better weapons. There was also a fear that the Russians might actually be able to launch missiles from space. And so there's this overall sentiment that we've got to catch up, we've got to get better at them in the space race. And so there became this competition to see who could get to space first. Well, who got there first? The Russians got there first. Who orbited the Earth first? The Russians orbited the Earth first. Initially, the Russians were way ahead. Now, eventually, the Americans were the first ones to get to the moon. And the Russians never even made it to the moon as far as I know. So Americans really think that we won the space race, and you can make the argument that we did. But as far as like actual helpful accomplishments in the space race, the Russians have a pretty good argument that they were pretty close to what we did as well. But anyway, it became this constant tension and constant competition to see who could become the first country to do certain things in space. And it eventually ended up with the United States putting people on the moon. Kennedy was the one that decided that we can put somebody on the moon and we're going to do it. And so he did. Anyway, that's the space race. And then there's this thing that we refer to as the missile gap. And there started to become kind of this common knowledge sentiment throughout the United States that the Russians were way ahead of us. And part of that came from the whole thing of they were ahead of us initially in the space race. People saw those lights going across the sky when Sputnik started to orbit the Earth. They saw that and they were like, man, we can't do that. They must be way ahead of us. And if they're way ahead of us in the space race, that means they're probably way ahead of us in the missile race too. They must have bigger, stronger, way more powerful nuclear missiles and bombs than what we had. And Americans, that was the common knowledge. Americans believed the Russians were way ahead. It was called the missile gap. So by now, Dwight Eisenhower is the president, and everybody's like, he needs to do more. He needs to get us caught up with the Russians because they're way ahead of us. Well, here's the thing. Dwight Eisenhower was sending these planes, these high-tech spy planes that could fly at like 50,000 feet. He was sending them up, and they were flying over Russia, spying on the Russians, okay, with big, I don't know, powerful cameras or telescopes or something. I'm not sure how they did it. But they were spying on the Russians. The Russians didn't know it. The American people didn't know it. The only people who knew it was Dwight Eisenhower and probably some of the highest officials in the land. It was a top secret project. Very few people knew about it. But it was a very successful project. And these U-2 planes were flying over Russia, spying on them. And we could tell that there was no, well, I shouldn't say we, Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, and the top military officials in the United States government could tell that there was no missile gap, that the Russians really were not any farther ahead of us. They weren't. They didn't have better missile technology than we did. And the reason they knew that was because of these spy planes that were keeping tabs on Russia. But it was a top secret thing. The general American public didn't know what was going on. And there was a reason they didn't know. Because if they did, then the Russians would have found out, and the Russians would have been ticked. Because they would not have been happy that the Americans were spying. Well, guess what happened? Eventually, one of those spy planes was spotted by the Russians and shot down. And now the Russians know that the Americans are spying. And that caused, again, a lot of tension. The Russians were not happy that the Americans were spying on them. But anyway, the missile gap. And one thing that I think that helps us remember, we hear about things going on in North Korea, things going on with Russia today, Iran, all these things, and we think we know everything there is to know. The thing is, we don't. There are things going on behind the scenes. Spying, there's all kinds of things going on behind the scenes that we don't know about. We just don't. And, presidents have a lot of information that their people don't know. And so they make decisions based on that. Not always based on the public opinion of the American people. Anyway. And then during one thing I failed to mention, I should have put this under the arms race. Another point I wanted to put under. Sorry, I know I'm messing you up. You can just do it like I'm doing, okay? My bad. It's something called mutually assured destruction. All right? MAD, mutually assured destruction. So this is the ideology that the United States has a lot of power, a lot of powerful nuclear weapons. Soviet Union has a lot of powerful nuclear weapons. If one of the other pulls the trigger on the other one, guess what? The other one's just going to retaliate. And we're going to destroy each other. Okay? So if Moscow, Russia, for whatever reasons, decide they're going to decimate New York City, so they launch a nuclear bomb, poof, wipes out New York City, what's going to happen? We're going to send 5 or 10 bombs back at them, right? And we're going to absolutely obliterate them. Well, then what are they going to do? They're going to shoot back. And we're just going to keep shooting until there's almost nothing left. Now, who wants that? No, okay? Even the Soviet Union, of course, doesn't want to be obliterated by nuclear bombs. Of course, nobody wants that. So a lot of people feel like the reason that the Cold War never turned into a big, huge, massive, violent war is because of this. Mutually assured destruction. If somebody pulls the trigger, if somebody launches a nuclear bomb, the whole world's going down. Nobody wants that, right? So the missile gap, and let's see, what else? Another country that plays an important part in the Cold War is the country of Cuba. I'm just going to write that a little better handwriting. Since I have such beautiful handwriting, I need to make sure it's good, right? So Cuba is this little island nation, 90 miles off the coast of Florida, not far from the United States. Somehow, amidst some kind of political upheaval and turmoil, this guy named Fidel Castro, through a revolutionary, through a revolution, he overthrows the Cuban government and sets up a communist government in Cuba, which is 90 miles from the United States. So it's one thing for the USSR to be communist and for Vietnam to be communist and even for China to be communist because they're thousands of miles away. But now we have a little country, you can almost see it from the southern tip of Florida, that's communist. And that means they're allies with the Soviet Union. And that's not good, right? So Kennedy, by now, John F. Kennedy is the president. He has to try to decide what to do about this. He comes up with one plan where he trains like a bunch of Cuban dissidents, guys who did not like the communist government there. And he trains them secretively in Guatemala to be like high velocity, what's the word? Sort of Navy SEALs or something. These big time freedom fighters, right? And he trains them with American troops with the intention of sending them back to Cuba to take back the government, thinking that once they start attacking and retaking Cuba, that the Cuban population would rise up and support them and help them. He also planned, or he told them, that he would give them air support. He would give them support from the Air Force. At the last minute, he backed off and decided not to do that because he was afraid of provoking the Soviet Union. So it was called the Bay of Pigs invasion. These guys invaded the Bay of Pigs, tried to take back the Cuban government. It absolutely was an absolute disaster. It didn't work. It was a huge embarrassment to President Kennedy. And it emboldened the Soviet Union. Like, okay, we can, the Americans embarrassed themselves. Let's go down to Cuba and let's get stronger down there. So what did they do? They started sending missiles to Cuba. And one day, one of the U.S. spy planes takes pictures of these missile stockpiles in Cuba, come back to the United States, and these government people start looking at these pictures and they're like, whoa, Cuba has missiles from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union didn't have the technology to shoot missiles all the way from the Soviet Union to the United States. But from Cuba, they can easily reach the United States. This is very alarming, very alarming. What are we going to do about this? We can't let this happen. And so Kennedy goes from embarrassment to probably one of the strongest, most decisive moves he ever makes. And he decides to set up a blockade around Cuba. So he sends warships, aircraft carriers, whatever, and he surrounds the island of Cuba. And he says, Mr. Khrushchev, who is the premier of the USSR by now, you've got to get rid of these missiles. And there are Soviet Union ships that are coming from the Soviet Union, I believe with nuclear warheads, to arm these missiles, right? And Kennedy surrounds Cuba with the blockade and says, if these ships don't stand down, we will sink them. And the world teeters on the edge of nuclear warfare, okay? And for about 24 hours, there was this serious fear all around the globe that at any minute, we could start seeing some massive destruction. Well, guess what? The USSR decided to call their ships back. Ships turned around and they go back to the Soviet Union. And everybody's like, that was close, right? It actually was so close. At one point, there was a Russian submarine that the United States Navy had detected, and there were several United States ships that had detected this Russian submarine that was loaded with nuclear warheads. And they started shooting depth charges at the submarine. Now, they weren't intending to sink the submarine. It wasn't like a violent attack. I don't understand everything about it, but somehow whatever they were shooting at, these depth charges, the intention was to make the submarine come to the surface and identify itself. They weren't actually trying to use military aggression against it. They were just trying to get it to come to the surface to identify itself. But this submarine is down here, and it has all these American ships shooting these depth charges, and the captain of this submarine has lost contact with Moscow, with the USSR. He mistakenly thinks that a nuclear war must have already started, and he's in big trouble, right? All these little depth charges coming at him. He gives the order to shoot a nuclear missile at one of the American ships. And there was one man on that ship, on that submarine, one Russian, I think he was second in command, who would not obey the order. And he kept arguing, and he finally convinced his captain not to fire the missile. If he would have, a nuclear war would have started. I never knew that until I just studied that actually today. But if you want to find a hero in the Cold War, you can talk about Ronald Reagan, and we will talk about him. He was a very important part of ending the Cold War. You can talk about John F. Kennedy, who had a lot of courage when he stood up to the Russians with the Cuban Missile Crisis. But if you want to talk about a hero, it was that guy. Okay, his name was Vasily Arkhipov. Okay, never heard of him before today. He's the hero of the Cold War, Vasily Arkhipov. Anyway, Cuban Missile Crisis. So anyway, this tension continues, and it starts, after World War II, continues all the way up into the 80s. Stalin died early on. He actually wasn't much of a player in all of this. He died not too long after World War II. Khrushchev was kind of the big guy, Nikita Khrushchev. He took over after Stalin, and he was kind of one of the main Russian aggressors. But eventually he died, and then there were several others, really old guys that took over and didn't live for very long, and they died. And then you get this guy named Mikhail Gorbachev. Mikhail Gorbachev, and it's Gorbachev, if you can't read my writing. Gorbachev. Mikhail is spelled let me make sure I got that right, Mikhail. Mikhail Gorbachev. Now he's a communist, but he is a much softer communist. Okay, he's not like Khrushchev and Stalin. He's not nearly as aggressive. He's not nearly as concerned about going out and conquering the world, right? He's much softer. I think he's also starting to realize people are getting sick of communism. This wonderful idea that everybody thought was going to fix the economy and make everybody prosperous and nobody poor and get rid of all the tyrannical government leaders was actually doing the exact opposite of what it was supposed to be doing, right? People were sick of it. And so he starts figuring that out. And he becomes a much easier communist dictator to get along with, right? In fact, I'm not even sure if you would call him a dictator. He's much softer. During this time, you also have a guy in the United States named Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan is very anti-communist. He is a strong anti-communist. Okay? He hates communism. And he stands up against communism for all it's worth. Now, he never actually, starts a war. He doesn't go after them with bombs and stuff like that. But he goes after communism as hard as he can. He decides, we got to end this thing once and for all. It's time to stand up to these guys, right? So the combination of those things, Mikhail Gorbachev, Ronald Reagan, but probably the biggest thing that leads to the end of the Cold War is, like I said, the fact that people are sick and tired of communism. Now, communism survives on lying to people. So even now in the country of North Korea, which is probably one of the most communist countries in the world, the people that are in North Korea, they don't know what's going on in the rest of the world. They're not allowed to see. Their internet is controlled. Their TV is controlled. Their media is controlled. According to their leader, they think they have it better probably than anyone else. They think that Kim Jong-un is their wonderful, loving father who cares about them and does everything for them and is helping them. That's what communism does. It thrives on lies. It thrives on keeping people in the dark. And eventually people started seeing that things were actually better outside of the communist countries, right? They started seeing, and one of the places was in Berlin, okay? These people in East Berlin, all they had to do was look over into West Berlin, and they could see that things were much better in West Berlin. So do you know what the communists did? They ended up building a wall around East Berlin with a barbed wire fence and armed guards with machine guns. Not to try to keep people out, but to try to keep people in. And one of our presidents made a point of that. I think it was Kennedy who said, our country's not perfect, but we've never had to build a wall to keep people in, right? I know Trump is talking about building a wall. He's not building a wall to keep people in the United States. He's building a wall to keep people out, right? Because people want to come to the United States. We don't have to build a wall to keep people in. But that's what the communists had to do. They had to try to forcibly keep people from running away. People started to wake up and they started to see this is terrible. This is not the way to live. And overall, this anti-communist sentiment began to just spread throughout the communist world. People were sick and tired of communist tyranny. Okay, so that's really why it ended. So Gorbachev decides to let some of these other countries that they had taken over, that the USSR had taken over after World War II, he decides to let them decide for themselves if they want to be communist or not. He's like, if you guys don't want to be part of the Soviet Union anymore, we're fine. You can go ahead and start your own government, which was a nice thing to do, right? So sure enough, all these countries just, boom, they changed back to being much more free countries again. They don't want to be communists. So they throw off the communist leadership. In Romania, actually, there was this violent uprising against their leader, a guy named Nicolae, can't remember his name. Anyway, and Romania had actually pulled out of the Soviet Union. They were their own country, but they were still communist. And there was this violent uprising against their dictator, and they killed him. Anyway, and they went back to being a free country, and that's what happened in so many of these other countries. They threw off communism, and suddenly there was this huge, massive pushback against communism, And all these countries turned away from communism and went running back to being more like the United States, more like a free country. Right now, not all of them were completely free, and some of them still have traces of communism there. But they threw off their communist dictatorship. And it all happened toward the end of the 1980s. I vaguely remember this. I was like 7 or 8 years old. But I remember people talking about, the Iron Curtain crumbling. The Iron Curtain fell. And it didn't just stop with these other countries. It went all the way back up into Russia. And eventually even Mikhail Gorbachev gets thrown out of office. He was the one that started the whole thing, that started giving people freedom. Well, guess what? They want freedom for real. They don't even want him anymore because he's still actually a communist. So they throw him off and they bring in this guy named Boris Yeltsin, and communism is over. So let's write down. Communism crumbles. In the late 1980s. Okay, so around 1988, 1989, early 1990s. And the Cold War ends. Okay, all that fear, all that tension, that nuclear bombs were going to start blowing up all the world. It ended. Now, it's kind of back again today a little bit, at least to a certain degree. People are concerned about those things, right? But it's not to the degree that it was 60 years ago. 60 years ago, it was a real threat. It was a real deal. One wrong move, and there could have been a nuclear holocaust. Massive destruction. World War III on a scale that no one would have ever imagined. A lot of people wonder, well, why didn't it happen? What kept it? Was it that, what's his name? Vasily Arkhipov, was it him? Well, in a sense, yes, it was him. My theory as a Christian, God is in control, right? God is the one that kept it from happening. Could it happen in the future? Maybe. But God is ultimately in control. He's not going to let anything happen that's not His will. And we can trust that. We can rest in that. We can go to bed at night, not be afraid of Cold War, nuclear war. We don't have to be afraid of. Well, now it's Vladimir Putin is the premier of Russia, and he's kind of flexing his muscles and trying to show his power too. He's probably not as bad as Khrushchev or Stalin. I'm sure he's not as bad as they are, but he's not great, and he's done some things that are pretty perplexing. Like, really, And then, of course, we have to deal with Kim Jong-un in North Korea. But again, God is in control of all of these guys. The book of Isaiah talks about how God breathes and kingdoms crumble. That's not the exact words, but these guys have no power on their own. God is in control. So we can rest in that completely. All right. So guys, I know, again, a long lesson. Feel free to take a couple days to get it done. I do hope you guys are watching all of these lectures and getting this information. So for homework, read chapter 28 in your textbook, Changing Frontiers. We're kind of jumping over some things and jumping back and forth in that book. I'm not going to cover everything. I'm going to kind of use my own method to work through the end of the 20th century and into the 21st century. But anyway, that's the Cold War, the war that never happened. That's all I got. Adios.